And tonight, ministers could postpone the UK's 2030 ban on new petrol and diesel car sales after the EU sensationally watered down their own restrictions amid angry opposition from German car manufacturers. The agreement passed by Brussels will now end sales of new CO2-emitting cars in 2035. That's 5 years later than planned, with no guarantees it will even happen by then. Meanwhile, the environmental group Friends of the Earth have criticised the government's revised net zero strategy, which has a greater focus on energy security and the economy. They say it falls short of the government's previously stated goals. So is the case for net zero beginning to crumble, and are Western nations beginning to lose their appetite for this expensive experiment? To discuss this, let's talk to the Mail, Telegraph and Spectator journalist Ross Clark. Hi, Ross.
Hi, Mark. Hi.
What's your reaction to this decision by the EU to give petrol and diesel cars a 5-year stay of execution?
Well, I think firstly it shows what we've probably always thought, is that the EU is run by German car makers and also French farmers. But I think in this instance, the EU has actually got it right. And, the EU and Britain initially ploughed ahead with this target of forcing electric cars on everybody and electric vehicles on everyone by 2035 without really sort of appreciating how it was going to get there. It was just sort of relying on the technology magically improving. It hasn't really. The battery technology is, it's gone forward quite a lot in the past 30 years, but it stalled a bit. And we with electric vehicles still have this problem with range, with recharging, and the cost of buying them. And don't forget, it involves about half as much carbon emissions again to manufacture an electric vehicle as it does to manufacture petrol or diesel ones. So, there are, you lightly used cars, actually, you can actually increase your carbon emissions by switching to electric. And, the German car industry has, it's lobbied for this. Because it's appreciated that consumers just are not switching to electric vehicles in the numbers that they were supposed to. In Britain, it stalled around about 17% of the market. Pure electric vehicles, 17% of the market this February. That's actually down a little bit from a year ago. So, the public, the realization now is that electric cars are not going to sell themselves. If we're going to drive them, we're going to have to be forced to drive them. And of course, that will drive people off the road and so on. So I think it's logical. And Britain is going to have to follow suit, because no car manufacturer is going to design cars purely for the British market. And if it becomes established across Europe that other countries have ranges of cars, including internal combustion engines powered by e-fuels, then there'll have to be a standard model in Britain as well, because we can't sort of exclude all European vehicles from our roads. And, if we tried to ban the sale of internal combustion engines here, then we would leave British consumers, British motorists, with very little choice.
Ross, do you anticipate that public anger and political pressure could see the end of the net zero project in countries like the UK and across the EU?
Well, I think either, we have this sort of magical technological breakthrough on all fronts, which allows us genuinely to get to net zero by 2050, which I think is very unlikely. Or, at some point there will have to be some relaxation in that target. And the trouble is, it's a legally binding target. So, the government's painted itself into a corner by committing itself to this target without any real idea of how it was going to get there. And yeah, the closer we get to 2050, of course, well, the more pressure the government's going to be under. And it's not just electric cars, heat pumps. The government wants us to, it was counting on 600,000 people a year switching their gas boilers to heat pumps. Well, it's the sales are less than a tenth of that. So I mean, the government's already falling behind its its targets on the way to net zero.
OK, let's get a brief word from my panel, if I may. And Mike Porky-Parry, you're a keen motorist. What do you think about this U-turn from the EU, who we thought had been drinking and worshipping at the altar of net zero? Quite the turnaround, isn't it?
I can't believe that the UK is now going faster into the madness of net zero and electric cars than even the red-taped EU. I just can't believe it. Electric cars in this country can never work for a number of reasons. Firstly, if we meet the targets of the number of people who need to drive electric cars to get us to net zero, we will have blackouts. We do not produce enough electricity in this country. We haven't got enough nuclear power stations. We haven't certainly got enough windmills and solar panels to produce the sort of energy needed if you want to wholesalely switch our cars to electric. It can't possibly work. We know already now that we are way behind in providing the chargers, and people don't understand the other problems, some of which Ross has raised there, that producing an electric car is far more damaging to the atmosphere than producing a petrol-driven car. Young kids in Africa have to go down mines and dig out cobalt and all that. But also, local authorities are having to examine multi-storey car parks to see whether or not they'd be able to sustain the parking of electric cars, because they are so heavy with the huge batteries they have to carry that the car parks might not be able to sustain them. They are also terribly damaging to the atmosphere because they're so heavy. Their tyres disintegrate far more rapidly than tyres on a petrol-driven car. They are absolutely a disaster to the whole of the way of life in this country, and we should take a wholesale review of kicking back this ludicrous 2030, 2035, 2050 dateline and push it back a century.
Well, I had to go to Mike Porky-Parry. He's a famous petrol head, of course. But look, the government would argue that the vast majority of climate scientists argue it's an emergency. We've got to get those carbon emissions down, is what they say. What do you think? Mark at gbnews.uk.